Why was she smiling? That's what the sentries noticed first. Not her slight frame, not the oversized duffel bag, not the nervous way her fingers drummed against her transfer orders. They noticed the smile, small, almost invisible, but there. Lieutenant Aria Voss stepped through the main gate of Camp Redstone on a Tuesday morning, and to every Marine who glanced her way, she looked like prey walking into a den of predators. 5'4", maybe 125 pounds, wide eyes that darted around like she was already lost. The kind of person who makes career warriors shake their heads and wonder how she even made it through basic training. The morning mist clung to the Virginia mountains, turning the sprawling military installation into something almost dreamlike. Parade grounds stretched out in perfect geometric patterns. Training facilities loomed like monuments to American military power. And somewhere in all that carefully controlled chaos, a 23-year-old communications specialist was about to slip into the shadows and become completely invisible. But that smile, that tiny, fleeting smile, if anyone had been paying attention, really paying attention, they might have wondered what someone so obviously terrified could possibly find amusing about walking into Camp Redstone. They weren't paying attention, that was the point. Aria's credentials checked out perfectly, too perfectly. Communications specialist third class, fresh from technical training, assigned to the quantum encryption project support team. Father was a mechanic in Denver. Mother worked at a grocery store. Community college graduate with average grades in computer science. Joined the military to pay for education and see the world. Every detail was real. Every detail was also meaningless. The truth was buried somewhere in the Pentagon, locked behind classifications that made top secret look casual. Only 3 people alive knew the complete story. 3 people who understood that the nervous young woman fumbling with her paperwork was actually one of the most dangerous human beings ever produced by the American military. Her real name wasn't Aria Voss. That identity had been constructed over 18 months by specialists who understood that the best covers weren't built on lies. They were built on half-truths, strategic omissions, carefully curated fragments of reality arranged to create something that felt authentic because most of it actually was. What those sentries checking her ID didn't know, what nobody at Camp Redstone could have guessed, was that Aria had spent the last 6 years being transformed into something that shouldn't be possible. Project Nightingale, an experimental program so classified it didn't officially exist. An initiative designed to answer a question that kept military strategists awake at night. How do you create an operative who can infiltrate anywhere by appearing completely harmless? While other elite units trained soldiers to look dangerous, Project Nightingale trained Aria to look defenseless. While Navy SEALs learned to dominate through physical presence, she learned to disappear through perceived weakness. While Special Forces operators cultivated intimidation, she cultivated vulnerability. The irony was almost beautiful. Here, surrounded by Marines who prided themselves on being the most formidable warriors on Earth, walked a woman whose skills would make those same warriors look like amateurs. 17 different fighting disciplines mastered to levels that left her instructors speechless. The ability to disable armed opponents in seconds using techniques nobody saw coming. Missions completed in 12 countries, without anyone ever suspecting she was anything more than a lost tourist or confused civilian. Bangkok, Beirut, Berlin, Prague, Lagos, Manila. In each city she had operated under deep cover, gathering intelligence that shifted geopolitical dynamics. And in each city, the people who eventually discovered what she'd done couldn't believe it had been her. The small woman with the apologetic smile, the one they'd barely noticed. That was her weapon, not martial arts, not tactical training, not combat skills, though she possessed all of those in abundance. Her true weapon was the human tendency to underestimate based on appearance, the instinct to dismiss what seems weak, the automatic classification of people into categories of threat or non-threat based on size, gender, demeanor. She had learned to exploit that instinct with surgical precision. As Arya approached the administration building, every aspect of her body language reinforced the image she needed to project. Shoulders curved inward, just slightly. Steps a fraction shorter than her natural stride. Eyes moving with wide uncertainty, taking in the massive facility like someone completely overwhelmed. Even the way she clutched her transfer orders spoke of insecurity. None of it was real, all of it was calculated. Her actual gaze wasn't taking in the buildings with fear. It was cataloging security measures, identifying entry points, mapping escape routes. The slight fumble as she adjusted her bag wasn't nervousness. It was muscle memory testing weight distribution, confirming weapon accessibility, maintaining combat readiness while appearing hopelessly unprepared. Through the windows of the admin building, she watched Marines conducting morning physical training. Powerful bodies moving with precision born from endless repetition. Discipline radiating from every synchronized movement. These were America's finest warriors, and they looked the part. In 36 hours, 8 of those warriors would make a mistake that would change everything. They would look at Arya Voss and see exactly what she wanted them to see. Someone who needed teaching. Someone who required hard lessons about military reality. Someone completely unprepared for their world. And they would be wrong in ways that would shock everyone who witnessed what came next. But that confrontation lived in a future Arya couldn't think about yet. Right now, her mission demanded focus. Intelligence analysts had detected patterns suggesting someone at Camp Redstone was stealing classified information related to the quantum encryption project. Technology, so advanced its compromise could shift global military power. Traditional security measures had failed. Conventional investigators found nothing. That's where she came in. The woman nobody would notice. The specialist everyone would overlook. The scared little communications tech who could slip into places where obvious operatives would trigger immediate suspicion. Her assignment was elegant in its simplicity. Infiltrate the communications department. Gain trust from personnel with quantum project access. Identify the security breach. Complete the mission without anyone realizing an investigation was happening. It was exactly the kind of assignment Project Nightingale had designed her for. A mission requiring someone who could become functionally invisible by being systematically dismissed and fundamentally underestimated. As she completed her in-processing paperwork, Arya mentally rehearsed the identity she would inhabit for the coming weeks. Every detail mattered. The slight hesitation before answering questions, the apologetic way she accepted her room assignment, the grateful smile when the staff sergeant patiently explained procedures she already knew by heart. She walked across the base toward her assigned barracks, passing groups of Marines who barely registered her existence. When they did notice her, their expressions showed exactly what she needed to see. Protective amusement, professional dismissal, the automatic categorization of someone who would need looking after until she either adapted or washed out. None of them suspected that the fumbling communications specialist had once eliminated an entire terrorist cell in Prague, using nothing but improvised weapons and psychological manipulation. None of them knew that her nervous habit of fidgeting with equipment was actually constant assessment of potential weapons and escape routes. And certainly none of them imagined that within 2 days, their casual dismissal would lead to the most shocking demonstration of combat capability in Camp Redstone's history. The sun climbed higher over the Virginia mountains. Arya Voss completed her first day of integration into military life at Camp Redstone. She had successfully convinced everyone she encountered that she was exactly what she appeared to be. A slightly overwhelmed young woman who would need protection and guidance to survive in their world. What she didn't know was that Sergeant Blake Morrison and 7 of his fellow Marines had already noticed her, already decided she needed to learn some hard lessons about military reality, already planned an encounter that would trigger events none of them could have predicted. But for now, she simply looked like a lost girl trying to find her place in a world of warriors, exactly as she had planned. How does someone become invisible in plain sight? 3 weeks into her assignment at Camp Redstone, Arya Voss had perfected the art of being forgettable. She moved through the communications center like a ghost, her presence so unremarkable that seasoned Marines would forget she was in the room within minutes of her arrival. Her desk, positioned in the corner near the backup servers, might as well have been empty for all the attention it received. The routine was numbing in its predictability. Every morning at 0630, she reported to the communications bunker beneath Building C routine maintenance on encryption devices, system diagnostics, equipment checks, the kind of work that kept military installations connected but generated zero prestige and less recognition. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had categorized her within the first week, technically adequate but lacking confidence, the assessment she'd worked to cultivate. Every morning, his voice carried patient exasperation. "Voss, did you complete the diagnostic on the satellite uplinks?" "Yes, Sergeant," she would respond, voice pitched with just the right uncertainty. "Though I'm not entirely sure about the calibration readings on Unit 7. They seem within parameters, but—" She would trail off. Let him fill in the blanks about her supposed technical insecurity. He would nod, make a note, move on to someone more competent, more worthy of his attention. Perfect. What Rodriguez didn't know, what nobody in that bunker could have guessed, was that Arya's supposed uncertainty masked observation that missed nothing. While she fumbled through routine diagnostics, she was mapping network architecture, identifying security vulnerabilities, tracking access patterns that might reveal who was stealing classified data. The quantum encryption project existed 3 levels below the main communications center. Access required clearances most personnel would never achieve, but information flowed upward through systems Arya maintained. Fragments, traces, digital breadcrumbs that someone with her training could follow back to the source. She had identified 3 suspects within the first 2 weeks, personnel with the right access, the wrong financial pressures, and behavioral patterns suggesting divided loyalties. Now she was narrowing the field, gathering evidence without raising suspicion. The invisibility helped. Nobody questions the nervous tech in the corner. Nobody monitors someone they've already dismissed as irrelevant. But invisibility came with its own kind of weight. Hours spent pretending to struggle with tasks she could complete in her sleep. Days of enduring condescension from people half as qualified. Weeks of watching Marines bond over shared experiences while she remained carefully apart, the outsider nobody bothered to include. She told herself it didn't matter. This was the mission. Discomfort was the price of effectiveness. Isolation was tactical necessity. But sometimes, late at night in her barracks, Arya wondered what it would feel like to be seen. Actually seen, not as the helpless specialist or the lethal operative, just as herself, whoever that was anymore. The thought never lasted long. She had work to do. Sergeant Blake Morrison first noticed her during week 2, not because she stood out, because she didn't. In a facility full of specialists trying to prove themselves, trying to earn respect, trying to make an impression, Arya Voss seemed content to fade into the background. That bothered him. Morrison had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, seen enough combat to recognize when something felt off, and there was something about the new communications specialist that didn't quite fit. Nothing he could articulate, nothing that raised official red flags, just an instinct developed through years of staying alive in places where instincts mattered. He mentioned it to his team. Hamilton, Wheeler, Chen, Rodriguez, different Rodriguez, Infantry, Martinez, Thompson, and Kowalski. 8 Marines who'd trained together, fought together, trusted each other's judgment. "There's something wrong with that communications tech," Morrison told them over beers at the enlisted club. "The little one, Voss." "Wrong how?" Hamilton asked, genuinely curious. Morrison struggled to explain. She's too perfect, too exactly what she's supposed to be. Nobody's that nervous all the time. Nobody fumbles that consistently without actually screwing something up. Wheeler laughed. Man, you're seeing ghosts. She's just out of her depth. Give her time. She'll adapt or wash out. But Morrison couldn't shake the feeling. Couldn't ignore the voice in his head saying something wasn't right. He started watching her more carefully, noting the small inconsistencies that nobody else seemed to notice. The way her hands never actually shook even when her voice wavered. The way her eyes tracked movement with precision that seemed wrong for someone supposedly overwhelmed. The way she positioned herself in rooms to maximize awareness while appearing to minimize presence. By week 3, Morrison had made a decision. If his instincts were right, if Voss was hiding something, then she needed to be tested. Needed to face a situation that would force her to reveal whatever lay beneath that nervous exterior. If his instincts were wrong, if she really was just a scared specialist struggling to adapt, then maybe she needed to learn that military life required toughness, required the ability to stand up for yourself, required spine. Either way, Morrison decided, Arya Voss needed a wake-up call. He pitched the idea to his team over the weekend. Nothing serious, nothing official, just a confrontation designed to see how she reacted under pressure, push her buttons, see if the nervous act cracked, teach her that Camp Redstone wasn't a place for people who couldn't handle confrontation. We corner her Monday morning, Morrison explained. Before her shift, nothing physical, just words. See if we can rattle her enough to drop the helpless routine. Maybe she'll show some backbone. Maybe she'll reveal whatever she's hiding. The plan was simple, too simple. None of them could have predicted what would happen when 8 trained Marines decided to test someone they assumed was weak. None of them understood that the woman they planned to confront had spent 6 years preparing for exactly this kind of scenario, had mastered not just combat, but the psychology of conflict, had learned to turn assumptions into advantages and underestimation into weapons. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. Arya reported to the communications bunker at her usual time, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with the uncertain steps of someone who hadn't quite mastered military bearing. Her mind was elsewhere. She'd identified the likely source of the quantum project leak, a senior analyst with access to classified systems and financial troubles that made him vulnerable to foreign intelligence recruitment. Now she just needed evidence. Concrete proof that would stand up to investigation. She was thinking about surveillance protocols when she noticed them. 8 Marines, blocking the path between the parking area and the bunker entrance. Their body language radiated intentional confrontation. Sergeant Morrison stepped forward. His expression wasn't hostile exactly, more like a teacher preparing to deliver a difficult lesson. "Morning, Specialist Voss," he said, voice carrying across the empty space. "We need to have a conversation about your performance here." Arya stopped walking. Her tactical mind assessed the situation in microseconds. 8 trained Marines, all significantly larger, all positioned to prevent easy escape, public enough to be witnessed but isolated enough to avoid immediate intervention. This wasn't official, this was personal, a confrontation designed to test her, to push her, to see what lay beneath the surface. She had options, dozens of them, but most of those options would compromise her cover, would reveal capabilities that needed to remain hidden, would transform her from invisible operative into exposed asset. So she did what Arya Voss, nervous communications specialist, would do. She looked confused, uncertain, slightly frightened. I'm not sure what you mean, Sergeant," she said, voice carrying exactly the right tremor. "Have I done something wrong?" Morrison moved closer. The others followed, surrounding her without seeming to realize they were confirming Morrison's suspicions through their own actions. Marines didn't surround administrative personnel for a conversation. They surrounded threats. "You've been here 3 weeks," Morrison continued. 3 weeks of fumbling around like you don't belong. 3 weeks of acting helpless. 3 weeks of hiding in corners and avoiding anything resembling military bearing. Arya's hands trembled. The movement looked authentic. It wasn't. "I'm trying my best, Sergeant. I know I'm not. I'm not as capable as everyone else, but I'm working to improve." "That's the problem," Morrison said, stepping into her personal space. "I don't think you're trying at all. I think you're playing a role, and I want to know why." The air changed. Tension crystallized into something almost physical. The other Marines shifted position, responding to Morrison's tone without conscious thought. They were creating a contained space, a pressure vessel designed to force revelation. Arya felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not anger, something colder, more focused. The part of her that had survived operations in 12 countries was evaluating threat assessment, calculating response options, preparing for what came next. She could still de-escalate, could maintain cover, could let this play out as a simple confrontation between frustrated Marines and inadequate specialists. But Morrison's next words changed everything. "I think you're hiding something," he said quietly. "I think you're not what you appear to be, and I think it's time we found out the truth." His hand moved toward her shoulder, not aggressively, almost gently, the gesture of someone about to physically guide another person, to assert dominance through contact. Arya's body reacted before her conscious mind finished processing. 6 years of training, thousands of hours drilling responses until they became instinct. Muscle memory developed specifically for moments when cover required protection. His hand never reached her shoulder. What happened next took 45 seconds. Witnesses would later struggle to describe it. Security footage would be analyzed frame by military analysts who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. But in the moment, for the 8 Marines who had surrounded Arya Voss expecting to rattle a nervous communications specialist, those 45 seconds felt like falling into a different reality. Morrison's hand moved toward her shoulder. Arya's response was so fast it didn't register as movement. One moment Morrison was reaching. The next moment he was on the ground, arm twisted at an angle that made Hamilton wince from 3 feet away. The takedown had been precise, controlled, designed to disable without serious injury. But more than the technique, more than the speed, what shocked Morrison was the absolute calm in Arya's eyes. The nervous uncertainty had vanished. What remained was focus. Pure, clinical, terrifying. Wheeler reacted instinctively, reaching for her. His combat training screamed at him that Morrison was down, therefore threat was present, therefore response was required. His hands moved to grab her from behind, to restrain, to control. He didn't even see what she did, just felt sudden pain shooting through his knee as her heel connected with surgical precision. Found himself on the ground next to Morrison, wondering how someone that small had generated that much force. Chen and Rodriguez moved simultaneously, thinking numbers would overcome whatever tricks this woman knew. They were trained fighters. They understood leverage, momentum, combat dynamics. 2 on 1 should have been overwhelming advantage. Arya moved between them like water flowing through stones. Chen's grab found empty air. Rodriguez's attempted tackle met redirected force that sent him stumbling into Thompson. And somehow, without seeming to exert effort, Arya had Chen in a joint lock that made him gasp. "Stop moving," she said quietly. First words she'd spoken since this began. Her voice carried no emotion, no triumph, no anger, just instruction. "Struggling will dislocate your shoulder." Chen stopped moving. Martinez and Thompson recovered from their collision, processing what they were witnessing with growing disbelief. This wasn't possible. The nervous communications tech had just disabled 5 trained Marines in maybe 20 seconds, without breaking a sweat, without even seeming particularly concerned. They attacked together, assuming overwhelming force would end this insanity. They were wrong. Arya released Chen as they approached, her movement flowing into a defensive position that took her out of their immediate reach while maintaining awareness of all 8 Marines simultaneously. Martinez threw a punch that should have connected, should have ended this. Arya wasn't there when it arrived. His momentum carried him forward. Her foot hooked his ankle. Physics did the rest. Thompson grabbed for her arms, trying to restrain through superior strength. Arya's elbow connected with his solar plexus, precise and devastating. Air exploded from his lungs. His grip loosened. One more economical movement and he was on the ground with the others. Kowalski was the last one standing, the last one still on his feet. He'd been watching, trying to understand, trying to process how someone barely over 5 feet tall had just dismantled 7 combat-trained Marines without apparent effort. "Don't," Arya said, looking directly at him, still calm, still focused. "This doesn't need to continue." But Kowalski's pride wouldn't let him back down, wouldn't let him acknowledge what his eyes were telling him. He moved in, technique solid, approach measured. He was going to do this right, going to succeed where the others had failed. Arya sighed, almost sad, then moved. The final takedown was different from the others, slower, more deliberate. Arya wanted Kowalski to understand each moment of what was happening, wanted him to feel how his own force was being used against him, wanted him to recognize the skill differential not through humiliation but through education. When he hit the ground, it was gentle, controlled, the opposite of violence. 45 seconds had passed. 8 Marines lay on the concrete outside the communications bunker, none seriously injured, all thoroughly defeated, all staring up at the small woman who stood among them looking less like a communications specialist and more like something else entirely. Arya's breathing wasn't even elevated. Her uniform wasn't disheveled. She looked exactly the way she'd looked before Morrison's hand had triggered this cascade, except for the eyes. The nervous uncertainty was gone. What remained was something older, something harder. "I didn't want this," she said quietly, addressing all of them. "I'm here to do a job that requires me to be invisible, unremarkable, dismissed." Morrison pulled himself to sitting position, cradling his arm. "What are you?" His voice carried on mixed with residual pain. Arya hesitated. Tactical considerations warred with human impulse. Her cover was compromised. The mission was potentially blown. Everything she'd built over 3 weeks had just collapsed because 8 Marines had decided to test someone they thought was weak. But there was something else, something she hadn't expected. Relief, pure, unexpected relief. The weight of pretending, of hiding, of maintaining that exhausting facade of helplessness. It had been crushing her more than she'd admitted even to herself. "My name is Lieutenant Arya Voss," she said slowly. "I'm assigned to Project Nightingale, a classified program you've never heard of and won't remember after this conversation is officially documented. I'm here investigating a security breach related to the quantum encryption project. And you 8 just compromised an operation that's been running for 3 weeks." Silence. Complete and total silence, broken only by Chen's labored breathing as he worked through the pain in his shoulder. Wheeler spoke first, voice rough. "Project Nightingale, what is that?" Arya looked at him, really looked at him. Saw not just a Marine who'd attacked her but a soldier trying to understand something that challenged everything he thought he knew about military capability. "It's a program designed to create deep cover operatives who can infiltrate hostile organizations by appearing completely harmless," she explained. "While other units train soldiers to look dangerous, Nightingale trains us to look defenseless. Everything you saw over the past 3 weeks, the fumbling, the uncertainty, the nervous incompetence, that was cover, carefully constructed to make me invisible while I worked." Hamilton shook his head, struggling to process. "You've been pretending to be incompetent for 3 weeks. Why?" "Because people protect what they think is weak," Arya said simply. "Because organizations trust what they've dismissed as harmless. Because the most dangerous operative is the one nobody suspects exists. Morrison pulled himself to his feet, still cradling his arm but standing with something like respect. What happens now? That was the question. Arya's mission was compromised. Her cover was blown. 8 witnesses existed who knew she wasn't what she appeared to be. Standard protocol would be extraction, mission termination, new operative deployment. But something made her pause. These Marines hadn't attacked her out of malice. They'd confronted her because Morrison's instincts had been right. Because he'd seen through her cover, recognized something off, and done what Marines do: investigated, tested, sought truth. In a strange way, they'd proven exactly what Arya's presence at Camp Redstone was meant to protect against. That even carefully constructed covers could be penetrated by observant personnel who trusted their instincts. "Now," Arya said carefully, "we're all going to report to my handler. You're going to be read into a classified program, and we're going to figure out how to salvage a mission that just became significantly more complicated." She pulled out her secure phone, made a call that would change everything, not just for her mission, not just for these 8 Marines, but for Project Nightingale itself. Because in 45 seconds of unplanned confrontation, Arya Voss had revealed capabilities that were supposed to remain hidden, had exposed a program designed to operate in shadows, had transformed from invisible operative to very visible problem. The sun rose fully over Camp Redstone. 8 Marines sat or stood around a woman they'd underestimated in ways that would haunt them. And Arya waited for her handler to answer, knowing that whatever came next would be completely different from everything that came before. Sometimes, she thought, the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what you're trained for. How do you explain the impossible? Colonel James Thorne arrived at Camp Redstone 4 hours after Arya's phone call. His expression showed the controlled fury of a career officer watching years of careful planning collapse in real time. He'd built Project Nightingale from concept to operational reality, had selected Arya personally from hundreds of candidates, had overseen her transformation from promising recruit to elite operative. And now she was sitting in a conference room with 8 Marines who knew things they should never have learned. The debriefing room was uncomfortably silent. Morrison and his team sat on one side of the table, still processing what had happened. Arya sat on the other, maintaining the calm focus that characterized her operational persona. Thorne stood at the head, reviewing security footage that showed 45 seconds that should never have occurred. "Walk me through your tactical assessment," Thorne said, voice clipped, not looking at Arya, studying the screen where her image disabled 8 Marines with clinical efficiency. Arya recited facts without emotion. Sergeant Morrison's observation skills exceeded assessment parameters. He identified inconsistencies in my cover. His team initiated confrontation designed to test my responses. Physical contact triggered defensive protocols. Situation escalated beyond de-escalation threshold. "You had alternatives to engagement," Thorne noted. "Yes, sir, all of which would have maintained cover while compromising mission integrity. Morrison's suspicions would have remained. His surveillance would have continued. Operational effectiveness would have degraded incrementally until cover failure became inevitable." Thorne was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to Morrison. "Explain your reasoning for confronting Specialist Voss." Morrison straightened, meeting Thorne's gaze despite the obvious power differential. "Sir, something felt wrong. Her incompetence was too perfect, too consistent. Nobody fumbles that predictably without actually causing problems. I thought she was either hiding something significant or needed motivation to perform at capability. Either way, confrontation seemed tactically appropriate." "Tactically appropriate," Thorne repeated slowly. "You surrounded a communications specialist with 8 trained Marines because her incompetence felt too perfect." "Yes, sir." Thorne's expression shifted subtly. Something that might have been approval flickered across his features. You trusted your instincts despite lacking evidence, acted on pattern recognition that contradicted official documentation, demonstrated precisely the kind of analytical thinking that makes effective military personnel dangerous to our operations. He turned back to the screen, running the footage again. Arya's movements were precise, economical, every technique designed for maximum efficiency with minimum injury. It was beautiful in a clinical way, the perfect expression of training refined to art. "Gentlemen," Thorne addressed the 8 Marines, "everything you witnessed this morning is classified above your current clearance level. Project Nightingale operates under authorities that don't officially exist. The capabilities Lieutenant Voss demonstrated represent years of specialized training that remains classified for operational reasons I cannot discuss." Hamilton raised his hand slightly, uncertain protocol for addressing a colonel in this surreal situation. Thorne nodded permission. "Sir, why does this program exist? What's the purpose of training someone to appear weak when we spend so much effort training soldiers to be strong?" It was a good question, the kind of question that deserved an answer. Thorne considered how much to reveal. "Because strength has limitations," he said finally. "Our most elite units, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, Marine Raiders, they're incredibly effective. But they're also obvious. You can train a soldier to kick down doors and dominate through force. You cannot train that same soldier to walk into hostile territory looking like a lost tourist and gather intelligence for 6 months without raising suspicion." He gestured to Arya. "Lieutenant Voss has completed operations in 12 countries. She's infiltrated organizations that would have killed Navy SEAL operators on sight. She's gathered intelligence that shifted geopolitical outcomes. And she's done it all by being systematically underestimated because people see her size, her gender, her apparent nervousness, and dismiss her as irrelevant." Wheeler spoke carefully. "So the program trains operatives to weaponize underestimation." "Precisely," Thorne confirmed. "The human tendency to judge capability based on appearance is predictable. Project Nightingale exploits that predictability." Martinez had been quiet through the entire debriefing. Now he looked at Arya with something between respect and confusion. "How do you live like that, pretending to be helpless when you're—" He gestured vaguely at the screen showing her dismantling his team. Arya met his gaze, considered the question seriously. "It's not pretending exactly. It's channeling a version of myself that could have existed under different circumstances. The nervousness, the uncertainty, those are real emotions I've experienced. I just learned to manifest them on command while maintaining operational capability underneath." "That sounds exhausting," Hamilton said quietly. "It is," Arya admitted. "Which is why operatives in my program typically don't maintain cover for extended periods. The psychological toll of sustained performance becomes problematic. Most assignments last days or weeks. This one was projected at 4 weeks maximum." Thorne cut in. "Which brings us to the current situation. Lieutenant Voss was investigating suspected intelligence compromise related to the quantum encryption project. She'd identified a probable source. 3 more days and she would have gathered sufficient evidence for prosecution. Now her cover is compromised and 8 additional personnel require security clearances and operational briefings." Morrison leaned forward. "Sir, what if we could help instead of hinder?" Thorne's expression became carefully neutral. "Explain." "Lieutenant Voss's cover as a helpless specialist is blown with us, but we could reinforce it with everyone else. We confronted her. She defended herself with some basic training. We were embarrassed and backed off. Story spreads that 8 Marines got shut down by a communications tech who knows judo or something. Makes her look tougher maybe, but not." He gestured at the screen. "That." It was clever, the kind of tactical thinking that made Morrison a good sergeant. Thorne considered the angles. "You'd be providing active cover support for a classified operation," he noted. We're already in it, sir, Wheeler added. Might as well be useful. Arya watched the exchange with growing interest. This wasn't standard protocol. Operational security would normally demand these Marines be removed from Camp Redstone entirely, assigned elsewhere, their contact with her severed completely. But Morrison's suggestion had merit. 8 Marines who knew the truth could be valuable assets if properly managed, could provide cover reinforcement, could watch her back while she completed the investigation, could turn a security compromise into operational advantage. There's another consideration, Arya said slowly. Sergeant Morrison identified flaws in my cover through observation and instinct. If he could penetrate my operational disguise, foreign intelligence officers using similar analytical methods might do the same. His team's confrontation exposed a vulnerability in Nightingale training that needs addressing. Thorne was quiet for a long moment, processing, calculating, making decisions that would reshape how Project Nightingale operated. Lieutenant Voss will complete her investigation of the quantum encryption breach, he said finally. Sergeant Morrison's team will provide discreet support while maintaining the public narrative that they confronted an administrative specialist with basic self-defense training. Upon mission completion, all of you will report to a secure facility for detailed debriefing about your observations regarding operational security vulnerabilities. He looked at each Marine individually. This is not an invitation to discuss what you've learned. This is a classification notification carrying criminal penalties for unauthorized disclosure. You've been read into a program that doesn't officially exist. That knowledge makes you both assets and liabilities. Understand? 8 voices responded in unison. Yes, sir. Thorne turned to Arya. You have 72 hours to wrap this investigation. Use these Marines if tactically appropriate. But remember, your primary mission hasn't changed. Identify the security breach. Gather prosecutable evidence. Complete the objective. Understood, sir. The debriefing concluded. Marines were processed through security protocols that made them part of something they'd never imagined existed. Arya returned to her barracks, mind working through new operational parameters. Her cover wasn't destroyed. It was transformed. The nervous communications specialist had become the communications specialist who surprised some Marines, still underestimated, still dismissed by most personnel, but now with a team who understood what lay beneath the surface, who could watch for threats she might miss while maintaining her operational disguise. It wasn't ideal, but tactical situations rarely were. The mission continued, adjusted for new circumstances but fundamentally unchanged. Arya lay in her bunk that night thinking about Morrison's instincts, about how he'd seen through carefully constructed layers to recognize something wrong, about how that kind of observational skill represented exactly the qualities that made someone dangerous to operations like hers. And she thought about how it felt to be seen, actually seen, not as cover identity or lethal operative, but as someone operating in the space between those extremes, someone trying to complete a mission while carrying the weight of pretending to be something she wasn't. The relief she'd felt when the confrontation ended, when she could drop the helpless act even temporarily, had surprised her. She hadn't realized how much the sustained performance was costing, how much the isolation of being perpetually underestimated was wearing her down. Tomorrow she would return to investigation, would narrow the evidence against her primary suspect, would complete the mission that had brought her to Camp Redstone. But tonight she allowed herself to acknowledge a truth she usually kept buried. Being invisible was lonely. Being constantly dismissed was exhausting. And having 8 Marines who understood what she actually was, who'd seen her capabilities and responded with respect instead of dismissal, felt like something she hadn't known she needed. Sometimes the greatest danger wasn't being exposed. It was forgetting who you were beneath the cover you wore. What does evidence look like when you're not supposed to exist? The quantum encryption project occupied sublevel 3 of Building C access, required clearances that took years to obtain and background checks that examined everything from financial history to casual friendships. The technology being developed represented a fundamental breakthrough in secure communications. Encryption so advanced that even theoretical quantum computing attacks would fail against it. If foreign intelligence services obtained this technology, the strategic implications would reshape global power dynamics. American military communications would become vulnerable. Allied networks could be compromised. Decades of cryptographic advantage would evaporate. Someone at Camp Redstone was selling access to this technology. Aria's job was to prove it. Senior analyst Marcus Webb had been her primary suspect for 2 weeks. His financial troubles were documented. Wife's medical bills had created debt that made him vulnerable to recruitment. His access to quantum project files was comprehensive, and his behavior patterns showed subtle indicators of divided loyalty. But suspicion wasn't evidence. Aria needed proof, documented transactions, communication records, something that would withstand investigation and prosecution. With Morrison's team now aware of her real identity, operational parameters had shifted. She could use them as surveillance support, could coordinate coverage of Webb's activities without exposing herself to detection. The morning after Colonel Thorne's briefing, Aria met with Morrison's team in a storage facility on base that provided privacy without raising suspicion. She laid out the investigation framework on a whiteboard, using methods that would have impressed case officers at any intelligence agency. Webb is selling access to classified quantum encryption files, she explained, voice carrying the confidence of someone discussing facts rather than theories. His financial problems create motivation. His access creates opportunity. His behavioral patterns create suspicion. What we lack is concrete evidence. Hamilton studied the timeline she'd created. What kind of evidence? Webb can't directly transmit classified material off base without triggering security protocols, Aria explained. So he's likely using dead drops or indirect communication. Phone calls to numbers that connect through multiple relays. Physical meetings with cutouts who relay information to handlers. We need to document the chain of custody from classified material to foreign intelligence service. Wheeler frowned. That sounds like it requires surveillance capabilities we don't have. We have them now, Morrison said quietly. 8 Marines who can rotate coverage without raising suspicion. We're not intelligence operatives, but we can follow someone and document contacts. Aria nodded. Exactly. Webb doesn't know I'm investigating him. He has no reason to suspect he's under surveillance. We use that advantage to track his movements, identify contacts, and build an evidence chain. Chen looked uncomfortable. This feels like something military intelligence should be handling. Military intelligence tried, Aria responded. They spent 6 months investigating with traditional methods and found nothing. Webb is careful, professional. He knows how security operates and how to avoid detection. That's where I come in. Someone he won't suspect. Someone who can get close while appearing harmless. Over the next 48 hours, Morrison's team provided surveillance coverage that professional intelligence operatives would have envied. They rotated schedules to maintain continuous observation without being obvious. Documented Webb's movements with the thoroughness of people who understood mission success, depended on details. And Aria used her cover as forgettable communications specialist to position herself where Webb's activities could be observed, without raising his awareness. The breakthrough came on day 3 of coordinated surveillance. Webb left Camp Redstone during off-duty hours, something he did occasionally. Normal behavior that wouldn't typically trigger suspicion. But Martinez, who'd drawn surveillance duty, noticed Webb took an unusual route. Drove 40 minutes to a shopping complex in a direction that made no practical sense. Martinez called it in. Morrison dispatched Hamilton to provide secondary coverage. Together they watched Webb enter a coffee shop, sit alone for 10 minutes, then leave. Normal behavior except for one detail. The folder he'd carried into the coffee shop wasn't visible when he left. Hamilton entered the coffee shop 3 minutes later, ordered coffee, scanned the space with the trained observation of someone whose survival had depended on noticing details, and spotted the folder tucked beneath a newspaper at an empty table near the window. He photographed it, documented the setup, called Aria. "Dead drop," she confirmed over the phone. "Classic tradecraft. Webb leaves materials at a predetermined location. Handler retrieves them later. No direct contact. No obvious connection." "Do we grab the folder?" Hamilton asked. "No, we photograph it and let the pickup happen. I need to identify who's receiving materials from Webb. That person leads us to the foreign intelligence network running this operation." Hamilton stayed in the coffee shop, maintaining casual presence while documenting everyone who entered. 17 people over 90 minutes, mostly locals grabbing coffee, some reading, some working on laptops, all apparently innocent. Then a man entered, mid-40s, unremarkable appearance, ordered tea, sat at the table near the window, opened the newspaper, and 5 minutes later left with the folder Webb had deposited. Hamilton photographed him, got clear images, ran them through facial recognition software Morrison had quietly accessed through military intelligence databases. The results came back 3 hours later. Andrei Volkov, Russian national with diplomatic cover working at the consulate in Washington, D.C., known intelligence officer, connected to operations in 17 countries, and now, thanks to Hamilton's surveillance, documented picking up classified materials in a dead drop arrangement. Aria reviewed the evidence with Morrison that evening. Photographs showing Webb depositing the folder, timestamps documenting the sequence, images of Volkov retrieving materials, facial recognition confirming identity. It was comprehensive, prosecutable, everything needed to prove Webb's betrayal and identify the foreign intelligence network supporting him. "We got him," Morrison said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "We did," Aria agreed, but her expression showed something else. Not triumph, something closer to sadness. Morrison noticed, "What's wrong?" Aria was quiet for a moment. "Webb is a traitor. He sold classified information that could compromise American security. He deserves prosecution. But he's also a man who made desperate choices because his wife has cancer and medical bills were destroying them financially." "You feel sorry for him," Morrison realized. "I understand him," Aria corrected. "Understanding doesn't mean excusing, but it means recognizing that people make terrible choices when pushed into corners. Webb isn't ideologically opposed to America. He's just drowning in debt, and someone offered him a lifeline that happened to betray everything he swore to protect." Hamilton had been listening quietly. "Does understanding change what we do?" "No," Aria said firmly. "Webb made his choice. Now he faces consequences, but I don't celebrate his destruction. I recognize it as tragedy. A man who served his country for 20 years threw it away because our healthcare system failed his family." It was a perspective that surprised Morrison. He'd expected operatives like Aria to be clinical, detached, focused only on mission success without consideration for human elements. But here she was, having successfully completed an investigation that would end a man's career and life as he knew it, expressing understanding for the circumstances that led him to betrayal. "You're different than I expected," Morrison admitted. Aria looked at him. "What did you expect?" "Someone harder, colder, more." He searched for the word. "Inhuman," Aria supplied. Morrison winced but nodded. "Project Nightingale doesn't train us to be inhuman," Aria explained. "It trains us to understand humanity well enough to exploit it, to recognize what motivates people, what frightens them, what drives their choices. You can't effectively manipulate human behavior without deeply understanding human nature. And you can't understand human nature without developing empathy for people making choices you might condemn. She stood, gathering the evidence they'd compiled. Webb betrayed his country. He'll be prosecuted. His career is over. His family will suffer consequences of his choices. That's justice. But justice doesn't require me to hate him or celebrate his downfall. It just requires me to do my job. The evidence was turned over to military intelligence that night. Webb was arrested the following morning. His computer was seized, revealing 18 months of classified material transfers to Volkov and his network. The quantum encryption project's security was overhauled. Potential damage was assessed and mitigated. Aria's mission was complete. Project Nightingale protocols dictated her extraction from Camp Redstone. New assignment, new cover identity, return to the shadows where operatives like her belonged. But Colonel Thorne had different plans. He called Aria to his temporary office on day 4 after Webb's arrest. Morrison's team was there too, faces showing curiosity about why they'd been summoned. Lieutenant Voss completed her mission with exceptional results, Thorne began. Webb's arrest prevented significant intelligence compromise. Foreign intelligence network operating in the region has been mapped and disrupted. Quantum encryption project security has been reinforced. He paused, looked at Morrison and his Marines. She accomplished this with assistance from 8 personnel who weren't supposed to know she existed, who adapted to operational parameters they weren't trained for, who proved that conventional military personnel can provide effective support for unconventional operations when properly motivated. Morrison sensed something coming. "Sir, what are you saying?" Thorne's expression shifted, something that might have been a smile. The confrontation that exposed Lieutenant Voss revealed vulnerabilities in Project Nightingale training. If Sergeant Morrison could penetrate her cover through observation, foreign intelligence officers using similar methods could do the same. That vulnerability needs addressing. He looked at Aria. "Which is why I'm reassigning you. No more deep cover operations. No more sustained performance as someone helpless. Your new mission is training military personnel to recognize and counter the kind of tactics Project Nightingale employs, teaching them to trust their instincts the way Morrison did, making them harder to deceive." Aria processed the implications. No more missions in hostile territories. No more weeks of pretending to be harmless while operating alone. No more isolation that came from being perpetually underestimated. Instead, she would teach, would transform from invisible operative to visible instructor, would help create the next generation of personnel who couldn't be fooled by appearances. It felt like being released from a prison she hadn't realized she'd been inhabiting. "And your team," Thorne continued, addressing Morrison's Marines, "will be the first students. You'll learn how operatives like Lieutenant Voss operate, how they exploit assumptions, how they weaponize underestimation, and you'll help develop training protocols that make military personnel resistant to those exact tactics." Wheeler looked stunned. "We're being recruited into counterintelligence training." "You're being recruited into expanding your tactical awareness," Thorne corrected. "Whether you continue in that specialty afterward is your choice, but for the next 6 months, you'll work directly with Lieutenant Voss developing and testing training methodologies." Hamilton raised his hand slightly. "Sir, what about what happened? The confrontation, the classified program, 8 Marines knowing things they shouldn't know." Thorne's smile became more genuine. "Sometimes operational security compromises create opportunities for improvement. Your confrontation with Lieutenant Voss exposed weaknesses we didn't know existed. Now we're adapting, evolving, becoming more effective because you trusted your instincts instead of accepting official narratives." He stood, dismissed. "Report Monday morning for your first training session. Prepare to have assumptions challenged." The Marines filed out, Arya remained behind. "You're reassigning me because the cover is blown," she said quietly. "Not accusing, just stating fact." "I'm reassigning you because you're more valuable training others than operating alone," Thorne corrected. "Your capabilities are exceptional, but your real gift is understanding how to be systematically underestimated. Teaching that understanding to military personnel creates force multiplication that exceeds any single operator's effectiveness." He pulled up security footage, not the confrontation, different footage. Arya in the communications bunker maintaining her helpless cover, moving through spaces as if invisible, operating with perfect camouflage created through weaponized weakness. "You spent 6 years learning to be dismissed," Thorne said softly. "Now teach them how to never dismiss anyone, how to look beyond appearances, how to recognize that the most dangerous people are often the ones nobody notices." Arya watched herself on the screen, saw the performance she'd perfected, the invisible woman in plain sight. "I won't miss it," she admitted. "Being invisible, it was effective but it was lonely." "Then it's time to be seen," Thorne replied. "Not as cover identity or covert operative, but as the exceptional soldier you actually are, teaching others, raising standards, making everyone around you better." It was permission she hadn't known she needed, to stop pretending, to stop hiding, to exist as herself without the crushing weight of sustained performance. That night, Arya Voss walked across Camp Redstone for the last time as Communications Specialist Third Class. Tomorrow she would report as Lieutenant Voss, instructor in advanced tactical awareness, visible, known, respected for capabilities instead of dismissed because of appearance. 8 Marines who had confronted her expecting weakness had instead revealed a better path, not through their strength, but through their willingness to question what seemed obvious. Sometimes the greatest victories come from acknowledging you were wrong, and sometimes being seen is more powerful than remaining invisible. How do you teach someone to see what they've learned to ignore? 6 months after the confrontation outside Building C, Major Arya Voss, promoted for exceptional service, stood before 200 military personnel in an auditorium at Fort Bragg. Her slight frame looked almost comical behind the podium. Some in the audience exchanged skeptical glances. Others had heard stories but remained unconvinced. She understood their doubt, expected it, relied on it. "How many of you noticed the exit routes when you entered this auditorium?" she asked without preamble. A few hands went up, maybe 15 out of 200. "How many identified potential weapons within arm's reach of your seat?" 3 hands. "How many assessed threat potential of personnel around you based on observable behavioral indicators?" 1 hand. Morrison's, sitting in the front row with his team, all of whom had become Arya's primary assistants in developing the new training program. "We train soldiers to be dangerous," Arya continued, "to dominate through force, to project strength, but we don't train them to recognize danger that doesn't announce itself, to see threats that deliberately appear harmless, to question assumptions about what makes someone dangerous." She clicked a remote. The screen behind her lit up with security footage. 8 Marines surrounding a small woman outside a communications bunker. What happened next generated audible gasps from personnel who hadn't seen it before. 45 seconds. 8 trained warriors disabled with clinical efficiency. The audience watched in stunned silence as assumptions about size, gender, and capability were systematically demolished. "Sergeant Morrison confronted me because his instincts told him something was wrong," Arya explained as the footage ended. "His observations were correct. His team's execution was flawed, but his willingness to trust pattern recognition over official documentation represents exactly the kind of analytical thinking that makes personnel dangerous to operatives like I was." She gestured to Morrison. "Stand up, Sergeant." Morrison stood, still uncomfortable with public attention but committed to the program. Sergeant Morrison saw through cover identity that had fooled intelligence professionals, Arya continued. He noticed inconsistencies others missed. He acted on instincts others would have dismissed. And his confrontation revealed vulnerabilities in covert operations training that needed addressing. He made me better at my job by refusing to accept what appeared obvious. She let that sink in. This program exists to make all of you better at seeing what others miss, better at recognizing threats that deliberately appear harmless, better at trusting analytical instincts that contradict official narratives. The auditorium was completely silent now. 200 personnel focused on the small woman who just redefined their understanding of combat capability. Over the next 6 months, Arya would transform how military personnel approached tactical awareness. Her training program combined psychology, observation skills, combat techniques, and scenario-based learning designed to break down assumptions about threat assessment. Personnel who completed her program showed dramatic improvements in situational awareness. They noticed details others missed. They questioned appearances instead of accepting them. They became harder to deceive, harder to surprise, harder to defeat. But more importantly, they learned to see people as they actually were instead of what assumptions suggested they should be. They stopped dismissing based on size, gender, appearance. Started evaluating based on behavior, competence, capability. The 8 Marines who'd confronted her became her teaching assistants. Each brought unique perspectives: Morrison's observational skills, Hamilton's analytical thinking, Wheeler's tactical adaptability. They helped develop scenarios that challenged trainees to recognize when something felt wrong even if they couldn't articulate why. One exercise involved infiltrating a secure facility using only social engineering and appearing harmless. Personnel dressed as delivery drivers, maintenance workers, lost civilians. The objective wasn't to test security systems, but to test how easily people could be dismissed based on appearance. Results were humbling. Trainees who'd completed weeks of tactical training walked past threats they should have recognized, failed to question people who didn't belong, accepted cover stories that should have raised suspicion. Then they watched footage of themselves being infiltrated, saw how easily they'd been deceived, understood how assumptions had created blind spots. The transformation was remarkable. Personnel who'd initially skeptical of learning from someone barely over 5 feet tall became her most enthusiastic advocates. They shared stories with colleagues, requested advanced training, applied lessons to operational deployments. Reports came back from combat zones. Personnel who'd completed Arya's program were identifying threats others missed, spotting behavioral indicators of hostile intent, preventing ambushes by trusting instincts about situations that felt wrong. The program's success attracted attention from military leadership. General David Patterson, commander of Special Operations Command, attended one of Arya's demonstrations. He watched her dismantle a team of Special Forces operators using techniques they'd never anticipated, saw how she exploited their assumptions about threat assessment. Afterward, he approached her privately. "Major Voss, what you're doing is reshaping how we train military personnel. The capability improvements we're seeing from your graduates exceed anything we've achieved through conventional training." Arya appreciated the recognition but remained cautious. "Sir, the training only works because it challenges fundamental assumptions. The moment it becomes routine, it loses effectiveness." Patterson nodded. "Which is why I'm authorizing expansion. Your program will be integrated into training pipelines for all special operations personnel. Eventually, conventional units as well." It was validation on a scale Arya hadn't anticipated. Project Nightingale had been designed to create invisible operatives. Now, its methodology was being inverted to create personnel who couldn't be deceived by invisibility. But success brought complications. Foreign intelligence services noticed American military personnel becoming harder to infiltrate, noticed patterns suggesting new training protocols, began attempting to understand what had changed, and they identified Arya as the source. The threat assessment came during month 7 of her new assignment. Intelligence analysts detected communications indicating foreign operatives were specifically targeting Arya for recruitment or elimination. Her visibility as a training instructor had made her valuable in ways that invisibility as a covert operative never had. Colonel Thorne delivered the assessment personally. Your program's success has made you a strategic target. Foreign intelligence services want either to turn you or neutralize you. We need to increase your security profile. Arya reviewed the threat intelligence with professional detachment. They'll attempt recruitment first, offer money, leverage ideological appeals. When that fails, they'll consider direct action. Which is why we're assigning protective detail, Thorne continued. Personnel who can provide security without restricting your training operations. Arya smiled slightly. Let me guess, 8 Marines who already know my capabilities. Thorne's expression confirmed it. Morrison's team has requested permanent assignment to your program. They understand your training methods. They've proven ability to adapt to unconventional operational parameters, and they're personally invested in your survival. It made tactical sense, but it also represented something else. The 8 Marines who'd confronted her expecting weakness had become her most trusted allies, had transformed from adversaries to protectors, had proven that being wrong about someone could be the beginning of something valuable. Morrison's team integrated seamlessly into expanded security protocols. They rotated coverage during her training sessions, maintained awareness of potential threats, operated with the efficiency of people who'd learned to see what others missed. But they also provided something Arya hadn't expected: friendship, real connection with people who understood both her capabilities and her humanity, who'd seen her at her most dangerous and still treated her as a colleague deserving respect rather than fear. Late one evening, after particularly intense training session, Arya and Morrison sat in the facility's break room reviewing performance metrics. Hamilton had just left after delivering updated threat assessments. Wheeler was coordinating security for next week's demonstration. You ever miss it? Morrison asked quietly. The covert work, operating alone, being invisible. Arya considered the question seriously. Sometimes I miss the simplicity. Missions had clear objectives. Success or failure was measurable. Now I'm teaching concepts that take months to integrate. Success is harder to quantify. But Morrison sensed there was more. But I don't miss the isolation, Arya admitted. Being systematically dismissed gets exhausting. Maintaining performance as someone helpless while operating alone creates distance from everyone around you. This, teaching, building a team, having people who understand what I actually am, it's better. Harder in some ways, but better. Morrison nodded. We've learned more from you than any other training we've received. Not just tactics, but how to see people clearly. How to recognize that the most dangerous capabilities often hide behind appearances designed to encourage dismissal. You already knew that, Arya corrected. Your instincts told you something was wrong with my cover. You trusted those instincts enough to act. I'm just helping others develop the same analytical awareness you already possessed. You're being modest. I'm being accurate, Arya replied. Great training doesn't create capabilities. It reveals and refines capabilities people already have. You and your team had observational skills and analytical thinking before you met me. I just showed you how to weaponize those skills. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Morrison asked the question he'd been considering for weeks. What happens when foreign intelligence services stop trying to recruit you and start trying to eliminate you? Arya's expression became serious. Then we demonstrate that being visible doesn't mean being vulnerable, that being known doesn't mean being predictable, that people who understand how I operate are still going to underestimate what I'm capable of. It was confidence born from experience, from years of operating in hostile environments, from understanding that the most dangerous weapon wasn't physical capability but psychological awareness. "They'll come," Morrison said quietly. "I know," Arya agreed. "And when they do, they'll discover that teaching others to see clearly means I've also learned to see threats they don't realize they're broadcasting. The hunter becomes the hunted, but the hunted has been preparing for exactly this scenario." Morrison smiled slightly. "Should I be worried?" "You should be ready," Arya corrected. "Which you are, which your team is, which 200 military personnel who have completed this training are. Foreign intelligence can target me, but they can't target everyone who's learned to think the way I think, can't eliminate everyone who understands how to recognize deception." It was truth that carried strategic weight. Arya's value wasn't just her individual capability. It was the multiplication of that capability across military personnel who'd integrated her training. Each graduate became an extension of her analytical approach. Each person who'd learned to see clearly made the entire force more effective. The threat to Arya personally was real, but the transformation she'd catalyzed was permanent. Even if foreign intelligence succeeded in neutralizing her, the training would continue. The methodology would persist. The improvement in military capability would endure. 3 months later, the anticipated recruitment attempt came. A woman approached Arya after a training session. Professional appearance, diplomatic credentials, offering consulting opportunities that paid far more than military salary. Arya listened politely, let the woman make her pitch, then declined with courtesy that masked absolute understanding of what was actually happening. The woman's expression shifted, professional mask slipping to reveal calculation underneath. "You understand what rejection means. What comes next?" "I understand exactly what comes next," Arya replied calmly. "You report failure to recruit. Your superiors authorize more aggressive approaches. Eventually, someone decides direct action is preferable to allowing me to continue training personnel who become resistant to foreign intelligence operations." The woman's eyes widened slightly, not expecting such direct acknowledgement. "And when that happens," Arya continued, "you'll discover that visibility creates its own form of protection. That being known means being watched by people invested in my survival. That targeting me means confronting not just my capabilities, but the capabilities of everyone I've trained." She smiled, not threatening, just confident. "Tell your handlers that Major Arya Voss isn't going anywhere, that her program is expanding, that every day more military personnel learn to see through exactly the kind of deception you represent, and that attacking her would simply validate the importance of everything she teaches." The woman left without another word. Arya watched her go, knowing the threat hadn't disappeared, had probably escalated, but also knowing she was prepared. Morrison appeared from where he'd been maintaining observation. "That went well." "That was the easy part," Arya replied. "Now comes the part where they decide I'm too dangerous to leave operational." "Looking forward to it," Morrison said with grim humor. "You shouldn't be," Arya corrected, but she was smiling. "But I'm glad you're here." And that was the truth. The woman who'd spent 6 years operating alone, being systematically dismissed, maintaining isolation as operational necessity, had finally found something better. A team. Colleagues who understood her. People invested in her success not because of what she could do for them, but because of who she actually was. Being visible meant being vulnerable, but it also meant being valued. Being seen meant being targeted, but it also meant being supported. Arya Voss walked out of the facility that evening knowing threats were gathering, knowing foreign intelligence services were planning her neutralization, knowing the comfortable safety of invisibility was gone forever. But she walked out confident, prepared, surrounded by people who'd learned to see clearly, and she realized that 45 seconds of confrontation 6 months ago had done more than compromise her cover. It had freed her to become someone better than the invisible operative she'd been trained to be. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is trust that being seen, truly seen, is worth every risk that visibility brings.